committee meetings to this evening. We'll start out by having the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Do we have any public comments? Okay. So we will go ahead and move into the buildings and ground agenda. So the first item is electromagnetic field EMF testing results, and Mrs. James is going to review that for us.
Yes,
Go ahead.
good evening. So as a yearly, on a yearly basis, we are doing EMF testing at both of our Worstown and our Landisville middle schools. We did the testing on the 10th of March this year. The results are back, and as you can see here, all of the indoor testing done at our Worstown Elementary School is registering below 1% of the FCC standard. The outdoor on ground level is coming in at 3%, below 3%, and the rooftop, which would be the highest point, would be the between 5 and 7%. All of these ratings come in very much below the margin that is standard. I did want to note that this year we have gone back to a company that there was some question about the company that we had used last year and their form of testing that they were doing. We have gone back to the original company that we used back in 2017. That is the company that we used this year for the testing.
What's the name of that company?
The company that we use this year is called Millennium.
Okay.
Yeah. And as you can see here on this page, this just gives you information about the equipment that they used when the testing was done. You can see here that the next date that the wand is due for recalibration is not until 2024. So this just gives you a little bit of information. I've included in the following slides about the locations, what the test results were. We tested inside the school, we tested at locations in all of the classrooms, both first and second floor. They were up on the roof. They did multiple sightings or multiple testing on the roof, as well as on the ground. They did the playground, they did the soccer fields, they did around the cell tower, parking lots, all locations around the buildings and so forth, and everything, as I mentioned, came in well below the standard that they had to meet.
Go back one.
Sure.
General population uncontrolled, because what does that mean? I mean, do they just test within the boundaries of the school?
Correct.
So there's nothing out in the
Community.
neighborhood or anything?
No.
We would only test on our property inside the school and around.
Right, thank you.
And so then on that same day, we went to Landisville Middle School. And again, same sort of results in the classrooms that were all tested was below 1%. In the outdoor on the ground level was below 4%, and on the rooftop it was between 4 to 6%. All of these standards are below all of these levels are below the standards. The next slide shows you again the same thing. The same equipment was used as with the first time, and everything remains the same. We included on the outdoor screening, that would include the baseball field, the JV baseball field, which is kind of sits down from the middle school, also includes the stadium, and then of course all of the classrooms and the rooftop. Any questions?
Mrs. James, am I recalling that at the Landisville property, we also have is it an electric substation back by the edge of the Landisville building there? Or is that a tower? And
It's a
it's the
tower.
tower
It's the
that I'm
tower.
remembering.
Yes.
Sorry, thank you.
Yes,
Thank you for the clarification.
yes.
So that could account for why it's nominally higher than Roarstown.
Well, what he explained to me is that any higher elevation as in a rooftop, like he looked at the results that we were getting as we were going along and he said, all of these are falling in line as to what he would expect. Inside the building, he would expect it to be that low. On the rooftops, he would expect it to be elevated because of the atmosphere at that level. And there's not as much interference as what would be like between buildings and structures and things
Right.
when you're on ground level.
Right. Thank you for that clarification. And previous allegations made to the district were that Wi-Fi within the buildings contributes to higher levels. And there were recommendations of reducing our Wi-Fi utilization, et cetera. And these facts don't substantiate that.
Correct,
So thank you for that.
correct. And we went into all the classrooms and every classroom was tested.
Yep. Thanks very much.
This was started years back when we added the second tower. Citizens were concerned, and so we do this annually just to make sure nothing's changing, but the numbers are well below the safe level, which is 100%. We're down around, I think our highest were 6 or 7%. So
Mhm.
Remind me, is it testing required?
I don't think it's required. I think we volunteered to do
We
it yearly
voluntarily,
for the community.
correct.
Now, if we've had a number of years where the levels have been fine and there's been absolutely no change, is there any reason to continue the testing in the future?
I would just want to, sorry.
We're not. My recollection is that we're not paying for this, is that Verizon pays for the testing, is that,
That's not correct. The district-
we're paying for it?
That's.
They
correct.
did initially grant, I
Yeah.
Oh,
think, for the
thought-
first year
well,
or
but
two.
The deal were that they were gonna pay
I
for
think-
it indefinitely.
We need to go back and look
No,
at some
I'm not
specific
sure that that's
documents.
correct.
What was that?
We need to
Mr.
go
Murphy?
back and look at some specific documents to really be able to answer both of those questions. Just to make sure that we're in compliance with any and all decisions, agreements from the past, with regards to who's paying and whether or not it is required. So we can certainly follow up on that. But we want to make sure that just based on some of those questions, I want to make sure we give you accurate information.
Mr. Jen, could you look that up? Because I have a very distinct memory that when there was a lot of citizen concern about the cell tower being installed, that Verizon agreed to ongoing monitoring at their cost.
Okay. And I do have, from the company that did it this time, Millennium, the gentleman told me that he had done testing for Verizon in 2017. And then, he did testing for the school district as well.
I don't,
Right, but that was separate from, you're right, it's been the same company, but
So
yeah, I would like to see that agreement because I
I
have.
actually
we
remember
have to
there
go
was
back.
some
So have we been
period
paying,
of
how much
time,
have we been paying for that?
more than a year.
We've been
But
paying
not
for it,
for
yes,
ever.
every year.
How much?
And roughly it's between $2,000 and $3,000 a year.
Yeah, and I would agree with Mr. Pomersky. We need to go back and check because we
Yeah,
might
sure.
be
Yeah, we'll check.
obligated based on some agreements. So
Sure.
Yeah, could you email
we
the
can-
board and let us know?
We can check on that, sure. Yeah. Mhm.
Thank you.
Sure.
Do you remember any more? Mr.
I
Donato?
see. I seem to remember, Mr. Keener's right, but I also seem to remember that they agreed for a certain period
number
of
of
time.
years.
I don't think it was indefinitely.
And yeah, I think we just all need to go back and reflect.
Check.
Yeah.
It's been several years.
Sure.
and I would just suggest to, no matter who's paying for it, is there really truly a need to continue to do the testing? I understand there may be some people in the community that are upset and concerned, but we've proven a track record now of a period of time, a number of years, obviously, that there has not been an issue and there have been no changes. I would just suggest we cease testing, period.
Well, before we would do that, I would check and see if there's some sort of regulation suggestion, like maybe instead of every year, maybe every 3 years. So we want to be in compliance.
Sure.
Sure.
The other part with that before we actually stop testing is to make sure that Verizon. I think part of the agreement is they may be able to change, change
Their
the towers,
screens and
change the
already-
systems.
Yeah.
And maybe I would agree that we stop testing, but if they make changes to towers, then go back and test.
And also then if they make those changes, if they just come and make them and don't notify us. I mean, if they're
That's-
supposed to notify us,
Yeah.
if the
That
strength
again
in
is
some way
something
is
to check in the
changed.
agreement.
Right, we'd have to look at
Yeah, I
the
guess
contract
We
for
just
that.
need to keep tabs.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we check back and see what agreements are, and
Mhm.
it's one of those things that for a little bit of money, it might make sense to keep doing it. So.
Or maybe just scale back, do it every other year or something like that.
Yep, we'll pull all the documents together.
Just as a point of clarification, EMF testing, what are the things that raise or lower that number? Just out of curiosity.
There's magnetic fields that I guess that's what they're checking for in the testing. So I guess the thought process is that the cell tower, I guess the fear, I should say, is that the cell tower would raise those magnetic fields.
Got it. What I'm getting at is, does it matter what time of day, who's there, how many people are in use of that cell tower, et cetera, or is that irrelevant? Just asking.
That appears to be irrelevant.
Okay.
The fact that there's people there or the temperature because, or the weather conditions, that appears to be irrelevant because actually the temperature and the weather conditions did change that day from when we went to Roystown to Landisville Middle School.
So conceivably, if I went and did a testing at 2:30 in the morning or on a Sunday morning, I would get the exact same reading as I would at 10:45 a.m. on a Wednesday when school's in session. Fair? Or no, is that untrue?
That is my understanding,
Okay.
yes.
I mean, weather may affect it a little bit and, but
Just want to make sure.
Yeah, I was just going to add the testing they do does cover all sources of RF. So it's not just the tower, it's Wi-Fi, it's Bluetooth, it's terrestrial TV, two-way radios, the works. Which, yeah, weather can obviously play a factor into all that outside.
I've
Thank you.
just received some additional information from someone who was involved in these discussions. That there was an agreement with the community group that was concerned about the cell tower. The testing would continue indefinitely at Verizon's expense. And I do think that was memorialized somewhere.
And
So,
you're
We'll
saying,
pull the,
Yeah.
yeah.
we'll pull everything.
Yeah.
you could check with Chris Adams
Documented.
because
We-
that happened he was highly involved for a few years. What's that?
We'll be able to pull everything.
Yeah. He would remember though. He could write a book on it. Chris Adams. You remember he was deeply involved in that. Okay. Anything else on the EMF?
No,
The only, Mrs. James, if I can just for clarification purposes, because I asked these questions of Mrs. James and I just want to make sure everyone is aware. And so I had shared, or she had reminded me that the first testing in 2017 at Roarstown was prior to the tower.
that's correct.
So if someone were to look at the 2017 Roarstown report, it's to know that it was before the tower existed. And then I had asked her, would someone be able to take the 2017 data and be able to do a natural comparison? And what Mrs. James, you had shared, and correct me if I'm wrong, is because of going to different locations, you do a number of testing in all the rooms,
Mhm.
but it's not like number one is always number one.
Correct.
So from like an apples to apples standpoint, if you were to match up the reports, is that correct?
Correct. And even outside, when they go up into the roof, they go to various locations on the roof. It's not one specific location, two specific locations, whatever. They go to various random locations. They go to various random locations everywhere. So you couldn't, in that respect, you couldn't compare apples to apples. There would also be, from one testing time to the other, even from one year to the other, if the instrument would be recalibrated, that could give a slightly different, not something substantial, but that could give a slightly different reading as well.
So is that noted in the reports? That the instruments are recalibrated?
So on the one slide that we had, it showed the next time it's required to be recalibrated, which was March of 2024.
So they don't. This is probably really petty, but they don't recalibrate that routinely? I mean, like with every 6 months or every year?
Apparently it's no, apparently it's not necessary to recalibrate it that often.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
Okay.
I believe the next item is lead water testing results.
Correct. So this again is something that we have done yearly for as long as I can remember. This is not it's not a mandated test by the state yet. But that's going to happen. So most school districts do voluntarily do the testing. And so we continue to do the testing. What happens with this is we started with the testing on February 28th this year with the high school. There are 10 sites that we go to at the high school and do the testing. And then there are 4 locations at all the other remaining buildings. Every building is tested. And it is sent out to the lab from the company that we brought in. The remainder of the testing was done between February 28th and March 9th. All of those test results have come back and they are all well within the standard, and in fact, very low on the scale. So.
Any questions for Mrs. James? Okay, looks like that's it for buildings and ground. Do we have any action items?
We do not.
So hand it over to Mr. Mauer.
So let's begin the finance committee meeting starting at 5:20. The first item on the agenda is the Lancaster Lebanon IU 13 general operating budget proposal. Mr. Bremersky, you have the floor.
Yeah, so the IU 13's general operating budget was shared with the IU board, which Mr. Mayor sits on. There are 2 different budgets there. They're kind of normal operating budget. While there's an increase to that, there's no direct impact to the school district on that particular budget. There is a slight, very nominal impact for the instructional management services budget, which we do pay towards. And it's approximately $1,500 increase from last year. And, it's been presented and reviewed at the IU board. We've had the superintendent meeting, Brillhart, Steinauer attended just to talk a little bit about their budget process. But the meat of the discussions occur with the board, Mr. Maris.
Yeah, there wasn't any other than what you just mentioned. There was no major changes here.
So just wanted to share that with you, and there will be a formal vote on that. We do that vote first at the April meeting, and then it will go back to the IU at that point. If you look at that and have any questions, please let us know.
Okay, thank you. Then let's move on to item number 2. Mr. Graham will present to us on the iPad, please.
Yep. So typically, the April board meeting has always had approval for the iPad lease that comes up for the following school year. And the finance committee meeting before that, we have just typically given you a quick overview of the lease that is coming up, since it is a fairly significant financial transaction, logistical endeavor, if you will. So coming up for the 23-24 iPad lease, once again, we did go out, seek some different proposals for the number of iPads that we are leasing. Providence Capital, who we have worked with for a number of years, was again the low bidder, so to speak, or provided the lowest cost proposal there. Which you can see, we'll get on the next slide. We'll go back through and look at historically some dollars per unit that we've been paying. But for next year, we are looking at a lease payments of $174,000 per year for 3 years, which is covering 2,075 iPads. One of the things that we restructured a little bit going into this year is purchasing a handful of the iPads outright as opposed to leasing. One of the challenges that we've always had is that we do have a small population of students who use their device year round. So this would be special ed students that use it as a assistive device for communicating, things like that. Students in summer school, athletics, music, that typically use their device all through summer. And as a result, we typically get those back to swap out after the lease is completed. And that also generates kind of a late payment due date, if you will. So what we did here is just took a few iPads off of that lease to account for that. We won't be keeping them. They will be turned around and sold. So we'll still be recouping the money at the end of the 3 years. There won't be any real loss there, but that gives us a little bit more flexibility in the return process. That's why that number is lower when we get to it on the next screen. A couple other quick updates before we do look at that.
Just a
Oop,
quick question.
yep.
What? I'm probably just don't remember this. What happened to ninth grade? And the keyboard trackpads?
We have only done the keyboard trackpad cases in grades 10 through 12. So just as a reminder, the leases, we are replacing iPads in grades 1, 4, 7, and 10 every year. 10 is typically 10 is where the new device comes in. That's why we introduced the keyboard and
That's why it
trackpad.
was at that time.
Yeah, the ninth graders are bringing their device with them, which historically middle school has been our highest point of damage, if you will. And so the heavier case that's on there, we've kind of wanted to keep just because some of those bad habits do continue on into ninth grade before.
The triple.
Yes, before they get to 10th. Although, as Mr. Donato and I were talking during one of the visits to LIC, if you do get a chance to visit one of the elementary schools, take note of I don't want to say the abuse that the iPads take, but I do marvel every time at the durability that as far as how well they have held up with the elementary kids flinging them around, so to speak.
There was one visit I went with Mrs. Hoover and we were in, I believe it was in the library and I don't remember which building, but the kids were using it and the teacher, it was either kindergarten, first, second grade. So it was primary kids and the teacher said, okay, put your iPads down. And they're all holding like this and proceeded with this problem. And I think I might even have said to Mike at the time, now I understand why we purchased iPads, because if you picked up those laptops, they were sitting crisscross applesauce on the floor, but still, even with little kids, you take your laptop and drop it on the floor, it's not going to work as far as they went with that. So
yeah, our damage rate is held very steady at around 7% for the entire life of the program. That really hasn't changed. Chromebooks or other one-to-one devices typically, if you talk to other districts, see much higher rates of damage. Chromebooks, I've even heard up to 50% in terms of the damage rate. So we've been very fortunate with that. Besides the keyboard and trackpad cases, we did complete a replacement of kindergarten through ESSER. And also planning on rolling out fine point styluses, the Logitech crayons in grades K through 6 coming up this coming year. We've purchased most of that, not all of it yet, though.
Mr.
Yep.
Mr. Graham,
Mhm.
I have a question. The 2,075 iPads for a little over $500,000. Are these exclusively for our students or are they for staff as well?
These are exclusively for students.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Graham.
Mhm.
Am I to understand, we lease each iPad for 3 years, right?
That is correct.
Okay, and are they sufficiently durable that we could keep them for 4 years? I don't know, I'm just thinking about ways to potentially. And we might see maybe the damage factor go up, but
Yeah.
the technology doesn't change that dramatically, that keeping it for one additional year. Could that be a
The-
way to provide an equivalent level of support and save? Probably $150,000, $200,000 a year.
The physically, yes, they do hold up. The challenge we typically see when you get into the 4th year is battery life. These devices do get used pretty much all day, so you do get a very high number of charge cycles on the battery. Getting into that 4th year with so many charge cycles, you run into problems with the device lasting the entire school day. And charging in and of itself on a good day is a challenge with 30 kids in the room, because obviously we don't have that much electrical capacity to keep things charged. If you're dealing with that many devices that are only lasting half a day in a good scenario, then it becomes a lot more difficult to deal with.
Would it be cheaper to just swap the batteries out?
Definitely not. It's not a user replaceable battery. We would have to physically remove the glass, which is labor intensive, violates warranties, and obviously
So it's not
is then gonna,
typical, like.
yeah,
Okay.
no, not anything that easy.
Okay.
And Mr. Graham, if I recall, the majority of the leases that are out there for this equipment run on a 3-year cycle.
Typically, yeah, iPads, you typically see 3 or 4 years. The battery charging issue is probably the biggest one.
Right.
Software support usually is pretty good, even into that 4th year. Other iPads we have in the district, typically we hold on to a lot longer, but they're also not being used in the same capacity.
Correct. And for the sake of clarity for the public, the cost works out to $294 over a 3-year period per student. That's less than $100 a year.
Yes,
And we still get back a small refund then at the end of these leases, which is offset
yeah,
on new
and that
purchases.
that $294 is the purchase price. And so we do fair market value leases, which means that we actually end up paying less than the cost of the
Correct.
device at the end, since we don't technically own them. So on the second slide, this gives you a little bit of historical perspective on what we've paid per iPad over the years that we've run the program, going all the way back to 15, 16. Because it is a fair market lease and we don't own the devices, they just get packed up into a truck and shipped off when the lease is over. They are then sold off by the leasing company for profit on their side. As a result, the dollar amount we're spending per iPad is significantly lower than that purchase price.
Yeah.
So-
But if I'm doing the math correctly, it comes out to $192 over a 3-year period.
I came up with $98 a year per iPad.
No, I took 529 divided by 3.
Which one are you?
I'm gonna trust Mauer.
You'd multiply 174 times 3 and then divide by the number of iPads.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's what I did.
It appears to cost the iPads
It's
are
198.
232.63 for the lease for the year per iPad, correct?
Yeah, unless I did my math wrong, it should be 232. But I can double check that.
I mean, how much do we get back at the end of the lease?
We don't get anything back. This is
No.
a fair market lease, so we're paying less per unit on the front
Oh,
end.
gotcha.
And then
Okay.
it just gets packed up on a truck. And then we don't have to deal with the logistics of selling things. We just put it on a truck and it
Just
goes
trying
away.
to educate. Thanks.
If you're wondering why the cost per iPad has gone up a little bit this year, interest rates have been going up, so obviously borrowing money is more expensive. Apple also changed their refresh cycle a little bit. This is the second year we will have the same model. So as the leasing company is calculating the residual value at the end of the lease, it's obviously going to be a little bit lower, given that it's now a 2-year-old model. We're still in a very good price range there for any one-to-one device, whether you're talking Apple, Google, Microsoft. That low $200 range is what you would typically expect to see for a decent one-to-one device in any district, really, no matter where you go. This slide, again, just gives you some historical perspective on the way we've structured the leases. We have always done, except for the very, very first year, replacing 1, 4, 7, and 10 with the same number of devices. And as you can see there, we are now into all the way up to 23, 24, and you can see what the line items have been there. And again, the main reason this is lower this year is, or has basically stayed the same in terms of payment, is we are leasing fewer iPads and purchasing a handful of extras to make up for those summer users that we don't get back in time.
Mr. Graham, can you explain your math on this? Because when I take the 232.63 and I multiply that by the number of devices, I come up with 482,707.25, not the 529,869. Can you help me understand?
1 second. I may have also made an error. Let me see. The 252 would be correct. If I did my math right, I will have to double check that.
You said 252?
Your 252, I believe, is correct. I will have to go back and double check why that was lower on that other slide. The leasing dollar amount, the 173 is correct, though. The outright purchase price, though, is still 294. That has not changed. So we're still at 250, or we're still below that, but
Okay,
I will double check that all those numbers are right and let you know.
okay, thank you.
Yep.
Did we ever, this is kind of an odd question, but did we ever look at? Is there any option that if the students wanted to keep it, that they could buy it? So with the leasing company, I guess we couldn't do that.
There is a buyout cost at the end if we wanted to keep them. At the end of 3 years, it's a little bit tougher to do. Most districts that do that typically do a dollar buyout lease. You end up paying a bit more on the front end. There was some interest when we first started the program, but at the end of the day, it's still a 3-year-old device that's been pretty beaten over the number of years. The logistics of doing it is also
Yeah, that
pretty
would-
heavy in managing
Yeah,
payments.
that
And
would be probably. difficult.
that's probably the biggest headache for us, just because we have so many other turnaround things to do.
Plus Apple and everybody, they want you to get something new every 2 or 3 years, you know?
Yeah.
That's the general model. Okay, thank you.
Quick question for a point of clarity. Do the teachers see teachers do not have iPads, right? As
They
we-
do.
They do. Like, got it. Okay.
Yep.
This is just students.
This is just
Got it.
students. The teacher ones, we have typically, I shouldn't say that, we have occasionally had them in the lease. That goes back to COVID when we had no clue what was happening. And we needed to get a larger number of devices in, just to catch up with everybody being virtual. We have phased that out because, like I said, with staff, we typically hold on to them for a much longer period of time. It's much closer to 5 years or longer on the staff side.
Cool.
And those are purchased out of the general
Okay.
fund.
No need to ask my other question. Then you answered it. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Mr. Brown? All right, that concludes the finance items, and we will move on to finance action items. There is an item for approval tonight, which is item 6B, which are contracts. We have a contract for Market Street Sports and the Hempfield Foundation for signs at the end zone in the George Alice Law Firm Stadium. May I have a motion for approval?
So moved.
All right, second,
Second.
very good. Any questions and or discussion? And may I have a vote, please? All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, and we have no one online this evening. All right, thank you very much. That concludes the Finance Committee
Yep, we
meeting.
have a couple more.
Oh, sorry. You? Oh, personnel action items. You want to do that as part of finance? All right, fine. Then we will move forward on those items. We have approval for some personnel action items. One for the approval of Mr. Gleason in the district safety, moving from the district safety and security officer to district safety and security officer effective March 14th. And then also for item B, approval to change Cheryl Orwin Bass from Director of Communications to Director of Communications and Community Relations. And then next, Security Officer to appoint Mr. Gleason as Safety and Security Officer for Hempfield School District effective March 14th. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Thank you, Mrs. Johnson.
I'll second.
Mr. Wagner, thank you for your second. Any questions and or comments? All right, may we have a vote then, please? All in favor? Any opposed? Our vote is unanimous. Thank you, everyone. We have some other action items. That being regarding Hempfield School District career readiness. And may I have a motion to approval of the Hempfield School District Career Readiness Plan as described by Title 22, Chapter 339 of the Pennsylvania School Code.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Donato. May I have a second?
Second.
please? Thank you. And may we have any questions and or comments?
Yes, I have actually two items to discuss before we take a vote. And one is on page 7 under leader, and then that also includes under advocate. I'm recommending a slight change to some of the language here. I realize it's minimal. However, I'm recommending that under bullet point number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, under leader, support and promote equitable access to program services and opportunities for all students. I'm recommending we adjust that to suggest that it says supporting and promoting access to programs, services, and opportunities for all students. I think the word equitable can find us in trouble, and it has a lot of different meanings. I would suggest the same change under advocate, and that is bullet point number 2, create equitable access. Again, just creating access to rigorous academic opportunities for all students, covers all students. And then towards the very bottom, and it's under the job description as linked to the counselor process. And under there, it talks about utilization. There's been some language added in multiple places there around utilization of inclusive language when referring to the school, and then it goes on. I'm suggesting that we consider removing that paragraph. That looks like it's been added. It's in different font, and it's in multiple places. You can probably find you one along the way here.
Control F. So.
Oh, yeah, I have it here. It's not far. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. There's a number of places at the bottom where you can see it's added. For example, slide 21. You look at slide 21 and you look towards the bottom, you'll see there's been 2 additions there. And it's in a smaller font. I'm not sure I understand the need for that language there, and I would just suggest maybe removing that one paragraph. So those are my suggestions.
Is that a motion or, I mean?
Well,
There's already a motion on the table and a
that's
second, so this is discussion period. This is simply discussion right now.
So just to clarify what you just said, because there are 2 paragraphs, which paragraph? He's talking about the first one, not the second, because there's 2 paragraphs with different fonts.
It's down on page 21, the last 2 items. Yes. Now, as a matter of point, may I request that Mr. Bremersky and Mrs. Hall comment on those possible changes, because this is not the purview of the board. These are not board documents. They are here for our approval, but we did not generate them, and I'd like to understand the reason for the language that was there in the first place.
So thank you for turning it back to both Mrs. Hall and myself. I'm actually going to ask Dr. Musser to speak to those because he would have the information compared to Mrs. Hall. I certainly can, but I'd like to start with.
Sure. A lot of that. My own here, Grant.
Dr. Marshall.
There you go. I'm waiting. There we go. Yeah, so a lot of that language is coming off of the state rubrics for counseling, which is why some of that language is there and why I believe the font is probably different when it was adapted over to our document. So as far as process, that's up to the board with the motion on the table. If there are changes that doesn't pass, we can make de minimis changes and still meet our deadline if that's the wish of the board. So it's solely in your court.
Dr. Musser, this is due to the state by April 1st,
I need to have it actually in by the 31st.
by the 31st.
So that's why we need to
So
vote on it this
that's-
evening.
So based on discussion, a possible. One, it's coming from state language. It's not anything that we didn't generate, even though.
Right, that's not correct.
but things were copied and pasted from one state document to ours.
Correct.
In one of the reports, does it not link to that state document?
It does.
All right.
And
So
Um,
I guess-
Mr. Wogelmuth's point.
Right.
Is that included in the state's language?
It is
the
not,
question.
is there anything else you want to add before I
No.
jump in? So based on the state's documents, those are examples of evidence. They are not kind of the end all be all that it has to be this way. It's the state saying, here are examples that administrators could work with counselors and or the same thing with teachers as suggested possible sources of evidence for them to be able to bring to the table in their evaluations being completed. But given that there was a motion first and a second,
Right.
there would need to be an amendment to that motion to make any changes before there would be a vote, should there be willingness from the board to do that.
So that leads us to the next point then. Is there a willingness to make an amendment? Or we could proceed and have Mr. Wogelmuth's commentary documented in our minutes as a point to be taken up for future revision.
What I would say is, I did a quick search. Mr. Walkermove's comment suggests that the concern is the inclusion of the word equity and equitable.
Right.
They appear 7 times in the document. So the board could either adopt the motion as is and with incorporating the current language. We could change equity to equal because there is a lack of clarity around everything that's, when you say equity, that had, as Mr. Maris said, or Mr. Walkermove said, means different things to different people, whereas equal is generally understood. Just would that potentially address your concern, Mr. Walkermove?
It would to a degree. That's better. I just don't, when I read that, I don't feel like it changes the intent of the language if you just remove it. And I think that it's hard. Life isn't perfectly fair. And when you start talking about equity, everyone has a different perspective on what that means. And I just think it creates some ambiguity that maybe doesn't need to be there.
So I leave it to the board for further discussion in terms of an action. Is there a willingness to propose an amendment here? We have,
I'm in support of amendment, but I didn't make the motion.
I obviously,
In what way?
I agree that I think some of that language could be taken out in those rubrics or whatever you want to call them. And then some of the language as far as equity, because the one was referring to sports. And as a whole, sports is not, I mean, you got the starting team and you got the juvies. And so everybody can't be a starter. So just that in itself is not.
Can I,
Equal.
where's the sports?
It
I'm
talks
just
about-
looking for, just curious what part.
It cooks.
given the position that we're in, Dr. Mosser, are we able to submit a revision at a later date?
I would like to make the timeline. We're getting pretty late
No,
to.
my point is we could submit it as is since we are in that position here right now with a first and a second. Could we make a correction or revision at a later date?
My understanding is that window's open to make that revision later, but if the board has very minor changes, I would like to make those changes now and not have
Okay.
to resubmit.
if
the
we would
board's-
approve this with the amended changes, then you could go make those changes and submit without another vote. Would be the suggestion, correct?
That would be ideal
That's correct.
if changes are wanted.
Correct.
So, Mr. Donato, I was equating this to like sports or any type of programs to support or promote equitable access to programs. Programs that is wide open to anything possible. So it could be anything.
Dr. Musser, this is referring to the academics, the actual, what I would consider the school piece of it that occurs from 7:30 to 3:30, or does it
Right.
apply further on?
Yeah, this is basically always on. Our counselors are always there for our kids.
Yeah,
Um,
it's, you know,
It is more of the on-stage type behavior and the rubrics that when they're assessed from that are generally the school time behavior, if
Yeah.
you will.
I would be replacing the word equal access would be, that would be all right with me to take equitable out.
Mr. Wong, do you have what you, I mean, I know it's being recorded, we'd be able to get it. Do you have it written down?
Yeah, I was just gonna recommend we remove the word equitable and continue without that word. So that would, if we were to agree, we want to amend the motion, that would be my suggestion. And also the removal, for example, on page 21 and the places that it's located, the utilization of inclusive language when referring to school community in regards to gender identity, gender expression, race, and ethnicity.
Could I ask why you'd like that removed?
Yeah, why would we want that removed?
Well, the reason I think, when I would suggest removing that is because there's a lot of ambiguity around that as well. And I think that comes without saying. I don't think it needs to even be said in this document. It's just a matter of treating people with respect and kindness regardless. So I think it's restating what I would consider the obvious, maybe.
If I may, I hear two
Mr.
separate,
Keener?
concerns here. First is with the language equity and what, if anything, do we replace it with? What I would, did you make a motion, Mr. Garber? Had you made a motion?
No.
I'd make a motion because there's motion on the floor.
You made a motion to remove it.
No, I.
No,
Yeah, no, there is no motion at this point.
okay.
We have a
Just
first and a
first name.
second.
Then
We were in
then
discussion.
I would move to amend the plan as follows by replacing the word equity and its derivatives in the 7 places where they appear with the word equal and its derivatives and making such other grammatical changes as are necessary to make each sentence work.
The only question, you do know that there are different words,
What?
equal and equity.
That's why I made the motion.
And I would
Okay.
say.
It-
look, the
I
dis-
just put a blanket wise, though, I'd want to be careful about the context in all those places.
I-
And where Mr. Okay,
Yeah,
M-
that,
Mis-
that substitution with changing the suffixes a little bit depending on how. it's
okay.
used.
I just want to make sure I have this permission of the board to
Mr.
make.
Keener, just for clarification, you're making a discussion point to recommend that. We have a first and second on the table.
Right,
So the
I'm-
first and second would have to be rescinded in order for there to be another new motion.
Or be voted on
Or
and be voted down.
on and be voted down. That's correct.
Or that's,
So-
you're chairing the meeting, we could amend it within the motion, but, okay. But maybe it'll be easier if we just vote and
I,
then,
I think it may be, given the differences of opinion that we have at the moment. So that said, we have a first and a second for the language as it currently stands. May I then have a
Can I
Mr.
Just
Brumersky?
add one more piece in there, so just for clarity's sake. Whether it's approved or not is irrelevant of what I'm going to say. But if it's not approved and the board meeting ends, we cannot take this back up until there is another meeting. And if it would not be approved, we would not have enough time to advertise for another meeting to get this submitted to the state on time.
It will be approved one way or another tonight. We'll figure it out tonight.
So-
I don't
Yeah,
think. we
we'll
need to go
figure it
push
out
that.
before we leave.
Right.
Agree.
So we would need to potentially engage in some further discussion. To
Yes,
bring this back, to be
yeah,
able to settle on what we.
Yes.
Would need
But
if there would
why
be a
don't-
majority of the board.
Mr. Maris, if I withdraw my motion, would you be willing to withdraw your second?
Yes.
all right.
I would,
So
so we could
do
go on
you,
with. I
do you withdraw your motion, Mr. Donato?
Correct.
And Mr. Maris,
That's
you,
the easier
you
way.
remove yours?
Mhm.
All right. So we now have a motion on the table to approve the plan. So
We don't
we've
have-
had discussion.
We don't have any motion.
No.
We have no motion now, right?
So it
Right.
was withdrawn, so you would need to ask, is there a motion to approve? And
With changes.
no, you would just ask generally, is there a motion to approve? Someone.
Well,
if they
that's where I
wish,
was headed.
Could say, I'd like to make a motion as follows.
Right.
That's where I
approval
was just headed.
X, Y, or Z.
Okay, so now may we have a motion to review and approve the career readiness plan and with any recommendations?
Okay.
My- Go ahead.
I move that we approve the career readiness plan with the following change. To, in the 7 instances where the word equity and its various derivatives appear, to replace equity with equal and its corresponding derivatives, and to make whatever grammatical adjustments are necessary to accomplish that goal.
Are you gonna add anything to that?
No, that is my motion.
I will second that.
It doesn't-
And
All right.
Mr. Driver,
So we now have a motion,
You can amend it.
right? Well, the point is,
It doesn't include,
let's clarify,
Yeah.
since we're at the point of discussion. The reason we are here now, and that wasn't included, Mr. Keener, would you be kind enough to explain why you didn't include the other 2 items that were discussed earlier?
you're talking about the language around,
On page 21, that is in the small font.
It also appears on page
let me
18 as
go
well,
to page 21,
or
in
18.
this
it's faster.
98 page document.
Regarding the school community, regard to gender identity, gender expression, race and ethnicity.
Some page.
I don't have an issue with that language. I think it is, we do it anyway, and we're not saying what language must be used, what language may not be used. We're simply, it's, as Mr. Waldemar said, it states the obvious. So does it need to be in there? Probably not. Does it hurt anything to have it in there? Probably not. I'm more concerned about the ramifications of equity, which means a whole lot of different things to different people versus equal, which is commonly understood. That is why I did not specifically include that language.
I would just add that my concern with that is it utilizes inclusive language. Well, what is inclusive language? Can somebody define that for me? So when you look at that, it leaves a lot of ambiguity there. So how do you gauge whether my language is inclusive or not, or someone else's is inclusive or not? It leaves a lot more questions than it provides answers.
I have a question. Why was that even added to begin with?
That was taken off of one of the state forms,
No, I understand that.
right?
Question was
Why
why?
did you pluck that out and put that in?
I would have to ask Dr. Sharp and his team who created the document. I can get that information back for you, but we are constantly working on creating a very inclusive educational environment as a public school.
Exactly. And all of our other documents promote respect and inclusiveness, correct?
Correct.
So
Without inclusive being defined, this is a dangerous piece of language in here.
I think some members of our board here continue down the path of trying to ignore the issues of gender identity, race, and ethnicity, and you continue to want to whitewash it by non-inclusion. And I think you run a dangerous path by not doing so. And you present a distinct impression to the majority of the public that you want to whitewash this issue. My opinion.
I would just go back to what I said earlier. It is very difficult to determine what is inclusive language and how does that only apply to certain individuals as defined in this sentence. It does not leave the appearance that it applies to all students. If we want to utilize inclusive language when referring to all students, I'm fine with that.
Could we change the end with regard to all students? Or something on that line?
Again, I would submit personally that we are micromanaging here as a board. This is a document prepared by our administration to follow, and we should not be inserting ourselves in as micromanagers of this issue. That is not our role as a board.
It is our role when we have to approve it. So if there's concerns, we have an obligation to bring those forward. And the way this stands, this is exclusive of certain students. If we're going to include all students, then let's say that.
You have a philosophical difference of opinion here.
Utilizing inclusive language with referring to the school community in regard to all students.
That works.
Okay. I would be willing to amend my motion to include that.
Can you say that again? Ralph?
Sure.
Actually,
Utilizes inclusive language. Utilizes inclusive language when referring to the school community in regards to all students,
and I would want to say,
or something that's close
we
grammatically.
want to respect all of our kids. If I called you Joe and your name is Mike, you wouldn't like that. So we want to be respectful of our students. If you say, I want to be identified as one of the new pronouns, and that's what you want, I would respect that regardless of what I think. So, because it's respectful, I don't want somebody calling me something that I don't identify as. So I'm just saying, whatever we're doing, we need to be, my feeling is, we need to make sure we are respectful to all of our students and their identities and their names and their preferences. I just think that's really important. And I do have, as you all know, I have children who would be included in this as well. I can't think of anything they've been called that would be in the bounds of politeness and correct discussions. But that's what I'm looking for, is that language that this doesn't actually make it, this says inclusive where it might be more exclusive. I mean, we can twist some of this.
I think we're getting to the point where we're muddying discussion and motions. So
Well,
let's be clear and finish the motion.
Clear in response to what you said, that I am totally respectful of the desire of what's going on and the intent of this. I don't think I'm not trying to whitewash anything or anything. I just want to make sure that across the board in our district, our students and teachers and us and anybody associated with this, that we are treated with respect. And I think that's ultimately what this statement is aiming for, but I'm not sure that it's actually precise enough to accomplish that.
I'm not here to argue that at this point, Mrs. Johnson.
So there is.
Mr. Keener.
So
I would be willing to amend my motion to add comma, and the 3 instances of inclusive language, changing, instead of specifying to whom it applies, specify that it says all students or all members of the Hempfield community as appropriate.
I'm happy with that.
All right. So is that your motion?
That is my motion, and
All right.
Agreeing to this.
Mr. Romersky, do you have a clear understanding of how and Dr.
Yep.
I'm good.
Mrs. Stryker, I'm happy.
We're
Okay, so you have a clear understanding of how you need to modify the document.
Yep.
And Mr. Donato, am I clear that you are seconding Mr. Keener's motion?
Change.
Okay, any further discussion?
Do we need a second?
Nope.
So we have a second.
I just want to be clear that the language was not made up by our staff. It was taken, and I found it directly from the
The
state
state
document for the evaluation tool.
I
that
get
they
it.
Proposed for our counselors,
Yeah,
but
we
for
understand.
clarity's sake, I'm not saying it.
we understand.
But I
It
just,
doesn't really impact.
no, but
Yeah.
just based on some of the conversation, I just want to make sure we're clear from our staff standpoint. But yeah, we have the motion, we're good, we understand.
Yes. And so there's no further discussion? May we have a vote then, please? Mrs. Johnston, do you have something for all of us or?
I just think it's kind of a redundant statement in some ways, because
Yeah.
that's what we're supposed to do anyway. I don't know if it's written down anywhere, but
It's written down plenty of different places.
We're good.
I agree.
So we're down to a vote. So May we have a vote? Everyone who is affirmative. All right. We have, you have your count? Any nays? And we have a majority vote, so. We have upcoming schedule items that take us through the balance of the year. If there are not any other items for discussion, then I would ask for a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
To an exec session for.
To an exec
informational-
session for information.
Second.
All right. Hearing none opposed, the meeting is adjourned.